Okay. I welcome everyone to today's Policy and Power Series, the forum that brings together regulators, policymakers, founders, and innovators who are building a resilient and future-ready power system. Today, we're honored to be joined by Commissioner Doug Scott, who's the chairman of the Illinois Commerce Commission. Chairman Scott brings deep experience in utility regulation, grid modernization, and consumer protection and plays a critical leadership role in shaping energy policy and long-term systems planning in one of our nation's most complex electricity markets. Chairman Scott, thank you for joining us and welcome.
Thanks, Tam. It's great to be with you.
Great, great. So to start off, sir, when regulators talk about grid resilience, what does that mean in practice from your perspective, and how has that definition changed over time based on your experience?
I think it means different things to different regulators. To us in Illinois, there's a technical definition, which is the ability of the grid to bounce back after there's an incident, whether that's weather related or otherwise, and the overall strength of the grid, how hardened the grid is against damaging storms and other events. But for us, it also means the ability of the grid to integrate all of the different pieces that are so important to us, the clean energy pieces. How good does the grid work with distributed generation to bring, rooftop solar, community solar in? How does it develop so that it can? We're looking at beneficial electrification in our state. How well suited is the grid for that? And we do that through a variety of different programs and processes in the state, working with our utilities. How well is the grid set up to interconnect? All of these different questions, and then obviously how hardened is the grid against storms? We've spent a lot of money in the last 15 years in Illinois on basic grid hardening. We had the Energy Infrastructure Modernization Act that passed in 2011, which really gave the electric utilities, a really good kind of process to be able to spend a lot of money to harden the grid, and that's shown up in the results. Both Commonwealth Edison and Ameren, the two major electric utilities in our state, both have really good performance, in terms of reliability and resilience. And so, now the question becomes, as we're moving more towards clean energy, how well is that grid set up then to handle some of the clean energy introduction that we're having in the state? And we've also, a lot of our homes are heated by gas in the state, so we've also had a gas grid modernization program that allowed our gas utilities to spend a lot of money to upgrade their pipes and their system, and that really resulted in a lot of really aged pipes being replaced. And so, we're constantly looking at all of those issues, and we're going to need to, because as you probably heard from other commissioners and other people in the industry, we're having a lot more storms. The storms are more serious. And so the infrastructure itself comes much more into focus. But I think we've been fairly proactive in Illinois about trying to deal with that and now to keep up.
Thank you so much for that. Could you give us then an overview of the Illinois energy slash regulatory landscape? Where does the commission have jurisdiction and where it doesn't?
Illinois is a deregulated or restructured state. You'll hear both those terms used, as opposed to a vertically integrated state like a lot of our neighbors are. And the difference is that we don't regulate generation in the state and haven't for 30 years. We went to be a deregulated state back in the 90s. And that means that, unlike say Wisconsin to our north or Minnesota, where the commission is making rulings on what types of power generation sources are going to be approved, we don't do that here. That we rely on independent power producers. Our utilities can't own generation here in the state, and so you were right when you described us as being a fairly complex market, and that adds to the complexity because we don't have some of the same controls from a commission standpoint that some of our neighboring states commissions have. So we can talk about it a little bit in the future because we're trying to get a little bit more handle on it than we've had with respect to generation. What Illinois has done instead has been to incentivize the kinds of generation that we want in the state. So we spent a tremendous amount of money on distributed generation, wind and solar, both rooftop, community solar, utility scale, on wind resources. We spent a lot of money to keep our nuclear plants open in the past because that's a source of a tremendous amount of carbon free baseline kind of generation. We spent a lot of money on energy efficiency over the years, trying to take down the amount of power that we need here. And then the new legislation that just passed in Illinois, the SURGA legislation, will add things like virtual power plants, thermal network programs, a whole lot of storage, of energy storage as well, and give us integrated resource planning like is present in a lot of the vertically integrated states, with the idea that we can try to figure out, and gives the ICC a lot more authority so that we can try to plug some gaps if we see some resource adequacy problems brewing in our state. So we've done a lot in terms of trying to incentivize different power generation sources, but it's really changing for us going forward, and we're going to have a lot more authority at the commission level, which isn't altogether different than a lot of other commissions have that
Mhm.
are vertically integrated and have that governance over generation, but we just haven't had that in 30 years, and now we're going to have it much more so, without having to go back to the legislature every time we need to make a change in a program, and so it'll make us a little bit more nimble, I think, hopefully, and that's the goal, and we appreciate the faith that the legislature and the governor have in us to be able to carry that out without having to go back to change legislation every time.
So two questions on that point. The first one is, if you do not regulate generation, how do you then address prices or tariffs or rates for consumers? And second one is, so are you responsible then for determining the the capital expenditure on transmission and distribution part of the network for the utilities?
Yeah, those are two great questions. So we still regulate obviously the distribution portion, and
Mm.
so we have a direct and significant role with respect to costs for over distribution. And so every time that the utilities come to us with either a multi-year grid plan, which they both have now, that also has a multi-year rate plan that's attached to it. So we're ruling on how much money they can spend and what their return on equity is for that. So it's a very significant impact there. In addition, we have responsibility over granting what are called certificates of public necessity with respect to transmission. And so the ability to say, yes, this line is needed, is something that we have as well. The transmission return on equity is fixed nationally, but so we don't control that that part of it from a cost standpoint, but the ability to say, yes, this transmission line is needed is something that we have.
So does Illinois allow then merchant transmission companies build new transmission, for example, interregional transmission or even intra-regional transmission?
Yeah, we do. We do not have a right of first refusal, so,
Mm.
that's been litigated, and it's also been a subject in the legislature, so companies that are not utilities or existing utilities are allowed to build transmission in the state. We've also done some things legislatively in both the recent SURGA legislation and in CEJA, which came about in 2021. I hate the acronyms, but they're there, so it's much quicker than saying the full name of the bills. But in both of those cases, there were pieces there that were designed to spur on or allow some additional merchant transmission to be built. So there, and just for example, there are two fairly significant merchant lines that are looking to build through Illinois. One is the Sioux Green project, which would bring renewables from Iowa into Illinois and eventually into the PJM marketplace. That's a great um, we it's a really a great example of trying to do something a little bit different with transmission because they're using all railroad right away.
Mm.
So that cuts down on obviously a lot of the issues with some of the land through which a transmission line would run. Should significantly help with costs too, because you're really dealing with easements from very limited settled landowners. So that's a example of a merchant project. And then the Grain Belt project, which is bringing renewables from Kansas through Missouri to Illinois and eventually to Indiana, connecting up with PJM there. The Grain Belt project has been on the books for a long time. It's been going through a series of litigation in different states. In fact, just last Friday, the commission's the one issue related to the commission's approval of the Greenbelt project just got it upheld. The commission's ruling got upheld at the Illinois Supreme Court. But this project's so old, Tam, that I was on the commission from 2011 to 2015. The first time I was on the commission, I voted to approve grain belt back then when I was on the commission the first time, and now it's come back through the commission a second time with other issues. And Invenergy is running that project again, merchant transmission builder, and that's the kind of thing. I believe that's a 2,500 megawatt uh, um, high voltage DC
Yes.
line. So you're looking at something that could provide a whole lot of energy to the state and the region. Don't know exactly where that will go, but it to your question, we've been, you know, obviously the details matter and whether or not something gets approved happens through court cases and through our cases as well. But, in terms of in general being supportive of merchant lines coming through, I think Illinois as a state is.
Okay, thank you for that. Maybe help us understand what the right of first refusal is, because you said Illinois doesn't have that. So for some people on the call who don't understand what that means.
Sure.
s-
Sorry about that. So the right of
yes,
first refusal is the existing transmission companies in the state that are usually utilities would be able to build, would have the first call at saying if a line is being proposed saying we want to build that and being allowed to do that. That's been rejected through legislation. It passed once. The governor vetoed it. His veto was not overridden. So what that means is the anybody that's qualified can bid in to try to build that that system. The governor's logic at the time he vetoed the bill was we're a competitive state in all different kinds of respects, including power generation. It makes sense for us to be in terms of transmission as well, in terms of a cost recovery method and protecting the consumers from that stage. Now, people that have right of first refusal will make other arguments that, well, you're dealing with known entities and you're dealing with local labor. I think both of those things can be addressed even in a state that does not have right of first refusal. Obviously, Illinois, very big state for organized labor. I think there are protections the state could do to make sure organized labor was working on these projects. So it's an issue in a lot of states. Wisconsin's tried to pass it. There have been states that have passed it, and then it got hung up in the courts. So I just mention it because it's something that's out there.
okay. Um, so let's move a little bit in the conversation to the large problem, or not the problem, like challenge that a lot of commissions are seeing right now with respect
Right.
to large loads. Across the country, we're seeing renewed interest in large loads, including data centers, manufacturing, and even electrification
Mhm.
driven demand. And you did mention that Illinois does have a legislation that incentivizes the electrification of a lot of the way we've been doing things, for example, probably even transportation. How has the commission been thinking about incorporating these large loads and sometimes, definitely on certain load growth? Because while we know that the load is going to double potentially by 2030, it's possible that that doesn't get built. How are you managing that risk, especially if uh, you have very limited oversight on generation? How are you managing that risk for consumers?
It's a great set of questions. And we've got what till 9 tonight. We can talk through this because it could probably take us that long to be able to go through all the issues. It's the largest potential issue that we're facing right now, and it's not all potential. It's here in some respects. You're right that there are many different factors that contribute to that. Illinois, with our clean energy by 2050 mandate economy wide. So things like building another either electrification or decarbonization. It's not an electrification standard, it's a decarbonization standard. But
Right.
electrification could be one of the methods for that. We've been very aggressive as a state to onshore manufacturing, especially as it relates to clean energy components. So things like building electric vehicles or the component parts for that. There's a lot of that reshoring of manufacturing going on here. And we've been very, very progressive in trying to make sure we get more electric vehicles on the road. So the charging stations and other things as well. But all that kind of pales in comparison to the data center potential that's out there. And I'll just give you a quick reason why. Outside of data centers, in the ComEd service territory, so that's Chicago and the northern third of Illinois. In the ComEd service territory, the largest single customer has a load of 80 megawatts.
Mm,
ComEd is talking to data centers that have a potential of 2 gigawatts. So 25 times the largest single customer that they have, and that's just one data center that they're talking to, and they're looking at multiple data centers that they're talking to right now. And in addition to that, while the factory or the 80 megawatt user, a large industrial user, might have some flexibility and load, they may be able to use demand response in times of need. Most of the data centers are saying that they need what they call 4 nines. They need reliability 99.99% of the time. So very little flexibility. Obviously that's very different than everything else that we're dealing with. And even electrification, if it were to happen, or onshoring more electric vehicles, you know, the impact of the data centers could be potentially huge. Now, I say potentially, and you brought it up in your question, the load forecasting for data centers is horrible right now.
mm,
So most data centers are developed under what are called non-disclosure agreements, legal term, which means that when a data center is talking to a utility, the utility can't talk about who's going to build, what the size of it is, and other factors, which means that, and we'll just use an example, a big hyperscaler, a Google or a Meta, Amazon could be talking to Commonwealth Edison. They could be talking to Commonwealth Edison about building a data center in ComEd service territory. They could also be talking to WEC Energy in Wisconsin about it and NIPSCO in Indiana. They're not going to build three. They're going to build one data center, likely, or none in this area. But that might show up in all three of the load forecasts for those three different utilities that they're talking to. And then the utilities send their load forecasts to the regional transmission or independent service operators, the RTOs and ISOs, in our case, JAM and MISO. All three of those might send that in, and then the RTOs take those load forecasts and incorporate that with the other load forecasts they get from the other utilities. We don't know exactly what that impact is. And if we get it wrong on either side, there are huge consequences for that. And your question, what if we build it and nobody comes? Now all of the other ratepayers are left saddled with having built a bunch of capacity that isn't going to get used, which just adds to costs. Or if we underbuild, we have not only the problem of having enough resources, lights, going out, that kind of thing, or a lot more demand response and load shedding, or the costs get very incredibly high again because you're purchasing more power from outside. So the idea of getting the load forecasting right is probably the biggest single issue that we can do, because then at least we'll have a good understanding of what we need to do. Uh, with in addition to that, so most states, including Illinois, would like to have the data centers in their state. And the reason being there's a huge amount of construction jobs that go with that. A lot of communities really like it, not all, but a lot of communities like it because there's huge property tax revenue that's associated with it. And a lot of people say, well, yeah, but there aren't a lot of permanent jobs necessarily that go with the data centers. And while that may or may not be true, there are a lot of, these are always, they're always repairing, adding, doing additional things. So there are a lot of construction type jobs that are there on a regular basis. But even if there's not, if you're a municipality, and I used to be a mayor back once upon a time, if you're a municipality and you get a huge property tax influx from the data center and there aren't a lot of jobs, you're not putting strain on other services. You're not putting strain on schools, you're not putting strain on housing, on other infrastructure issues. So a lot of communities really want the data centers. And for a state like Illinois, you could say, well, yeah, but you don't have to take them in your state, and you don't. But if they locate somewhere else in PJM or in MISO, that's going to increase the power need in PJM or MISO, which increase the costs for them, and our ratepayers will pay for it anyway, at least a portion of it anyway. So the feeling is bring them in, but under a couple of conditions. Let's make sure we have the resource adequacy for them. And I'll get to the last question he asked because that it affects that. And also the second part is make sure that other ratepayers aren't holding the bag and paying for costs that should be assumed by the data center. And so those are the two biggest issues that we're seeing. It sounds easier than it is. And there's a couple ways to go about that. One would be from a regulatory standpoint, you'll see in a bunch of states, and we have one in front of us now, so I can't talk about it in detail, but a large load tariff. So if somebody is approaching Commonwealth Edison in this case, because they filed the tariff, here are the conditions under which we'll operate. And some of that is more money up front so that they make sure that people who are coming to them and approaching them are serious about it. In other states, you've seen take or pay contracts. So yes, I want to locate my data center in your community. AEP in Ohio, for example, has a tariff that says, well, you'll pay 80% of the power for 80% of the power you say you need for 10 years. And that way we're making sure that either you're coming and you're going to use this power or you're paying for the power, and we can figure out a different way to that way our ratepayers aren't getting hit with the cost. Us as a restructured state, to your question, it's all of the other things that I talked about before. It's all of the other incentives to keep the nuclear plants open, or in Surgia, lifting the moratorium on new nuclear plants. So we have the largest nuclear fleet in the country right now, all of it owned by Constellation. The idea being if you lift the moratorium on new nuclear plants, the economics as such right now with the large loads coming on, nuclear becomes a lot more economic than it had been over the years where we were creating a framework to keep them alive and keep them going. Now they don't need that so much because they've got these other large load customers. Perhaps you see new nuclear built in a state like Illinois, even though we're not regulating that. And then all of the other things we talked about, everything from a lot more distributed generation to a lot of storage generation, because it's not just a raw numbers kind of thing with the data centers coming in. The major problem that you've got is at peak. So if things like storage or time of use pricing, which is also reflected in the new legislation, we're trying to be as proactive as we can to work on that, and then it'll be up to us from the new integrated resource planning that's part of Surja. It'll be up to us working in conjunction with the other state agencies and with stakeholders to try to develop the plan to plug any gaps that we see coming from that. So that was really long, and I apologize for that, but it's obviously a huge issue, and we can't go into a meeting without talking about data centers or affordability or both, and it's usually both.
Could you help us understand the mechanics of how this works? So the utilities, since they can't own generation, they're meant to procure generation. And how do they file rate cases and based on the contracts their procurement contract to determine what the rates of consumers are going to pay? Because I'm assuming while generation is if generation is decoupled from or generation is basically deregulated, retail marketing also deregulated?
Yeah, so it's a great question. So consumers in Illinois have the ability to buy their electrons from whomever they want to,
Okay.
within within reason. I mean, they have to be certified. The alternative retail electric suppliers have to be certified to operate. But once they are, if I, as a consumer, could say, "I'm in ComEd service territory, but I like company X, so I want to buy my energy from them." And they may offer a different price. They may offer deal on weekends. They may offer more clean energy. You're buying to guarantee that. The alternative suppliers are responsible for procuring their own energy. So they're working, with 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 different power generators to buy the energy, and then they will sell it to consumers in Illinois. It all shows up on your one bill. So if you're a ComEd customer or an Ameren customer, it comes on your distribution bill, and there's a line item that says, your power is purchased from X company, and here's the amount of power for that. Now, if you decide you don't want to change and you want to just you stay as a default customer of either Commonwealth Edison or Ameren, they don't buy the power. We purchase that through the Illinois Power Agency, which is a different unit of government in Illinois. And the Illinois Power Agency holds auctions, and bidders will come in and bid for the amount of default generation that we think we're going to need, that the IPA thinks we're going to need to satisfy all of the customers who haven't switched. And that ebbs and flows at different times. When there was something that we have called retail aggregation, which means if you live in a city in Illinois and the city decides to have a vote and say, we will give the city authority to aggregate all of our load. And then the idea behind it being they would be able to procure a cheaper price, and then they can work with an alternative retail supplier there. Individuals can opt out of that if they want to, but a lot of when that first came in, and then there was some ability to do some better prices out there. You saw a lot of communities do that. And so the IPA has to be careful and make sure that they're procuring the amount of power that they need, and not a whole lot more. But they've been very good and very, very successful at that. And then they will also try to hedge. If they're looking at what's going to happen with prices going forward, they're also going to try to hedge to make sure that they're getting enough power on and getting it as cheaply as they possibly can. So your point about us being very complicated is well taken, because it
Yeah.
gets more complicated all the time.
Yeah, yeah. That is thanks for that background. It was very
Sure,
helpful. So
sure.
essentially the commission regulates T&D utilities in Illinois, to put it very simply.
Yeah.
So what do you think has been the major challenge to get transmission built in the States? Because you did mention So Green and you did mention Greenbelt. And I think I've heard of both projects since 2016 or 2017, and they've been ongoing. And I don't think any steel has been put in the ground yet for any of those projects.
Just
Uh,
in general, I don't think it's an Illinois thing. Because we're one of a number of states in both those projects. I
okay.
think it's more just it's difficult for merchant transmission to get built. I just think it's more difficult generally. The RTOs and the ISOs. Now, this isn't true all over the country because they don't all have them, but in our case, a lot of the transmission work that's being done, especially the longer term transmission work, is being done through planning by the RTOs and the ISOs and MISO, for example. Very good long term plan for doing that. How Green and a grain belt would fit into that may be a bit of a challenge as well. So inter trustate, in terms of relieving congestion or getting the generation closer to load and things like that. We've had a pretty good record of building transmission as that's been needed. We just approved a couple of lines within the last few months, and that's something that will come up from time to time with our utilities. Will suggest that line, certain lines be done. And so that's not as hard. It's the interstate that makes it a little bit more of a challenge.
Do
Plus,
you
you're also
think
dealing with a bunch of states. So,
yes,
take grain belt, for example, you have to have Kansas, Missouri, Illinois, Indiana all feeling the same, all feeling the same way about it. And because transmission just in general, especially interstate transmission, takes a lot of time, commissions change, the policies of different states can change from time to time. And so
mhm.
it's not like you go through it once, as we've seen with grain belt. You're dealing with lots of different administrations and lots of different commissions.
Do you think that it might be the case that in many states to 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 build transmission, you need a certificate of public convenience or need, and to hold that certificate carries the power of eminent domain, and many states don't want to give that power to entities that are not necessarily serving in the public interest of the state in general, and it's more difficult to argue that an MT is serving, even though it is, but it's easier to argue that a utility is because a utility has customers in the state. Do you think that might be the challenge? And do you
Yeah.
think that there might be a way to think about creating voluntary easement acquisitions that could be allowed, that MTCs could use to kind of make their projects get built faster?
Yeah, I think the eminent domain issue is a big one, and has been. And you just saw that again with respect to Grainbelt and the former Attorney General of Missouri, who now works for the FBI, I believe. But he was taking action against that in large part because of the eminent domain. You also have an issue with some states. Say, for example, a state that the transmission line is going through them but isn't necessarily going to stop in their state. And so a lot of times it's difficult for the transmission owners to show these other states from whom they need approval, but it's difficult to show them there's going to be benefit to them. Now, you can make an argument, and I could easily make an argument that if Grainbelt, for example, ends up in PJM, the fact that it ends up in PJM with 2,500 megawatts of energy, that has a great impact on PJM and will benefit us, whether it stops in Illinois or not. Now, it'll obviously have a much greater impact if it stops in Illinois and there's some kind of arrangement made for the power there. But even if it just ends up in PJM or MISO, there's a benefit to Illinois ratepayers as a result of that. But that's a little bit harder to explain, and you've gotta understand how the markets work, and so I think that's an issue as well. And I also think that the yes, the RTOs have their own planning processes, but I think RTOs figuring out a way to be a little bit more welcoming of merchant transmission would be helpful as well. I also think, to your point, a lot, and because of what you mentioned about eminent domain, a lot of the transmission folks try not to use it if they can help it. That isn't always the case, and then you end up with something like Sioux Green, for example, where you're just dealing with right away that the railroad zone, and that may be difficult negotiation in itself, but it's probably not the same as acquiring from 1,000 different landowners in different places. So I think there are ways to try to address this. We've also in Illinois put out something called the Renewable Energy Access Plan, or the REAP, and we just are completing the second REAP now. And the idea behind the Renewable Energy Access Plan is to both talk about how much renewable energy we will need to meet our goals, and also how much transmission that will need to meet our goals. And then what are some of the most likely places for that? What are the places that make the most sense given where the load is going to be, and then given where the power sources are, how will that transmission work? So we're trying to give enough of a heads up as to here's some of the areas that we think are going to be needed for transmission. But any kind of siting right now, whether it's transmission, pipelines, solar arrays, wind farms, it's all difficult right now. It actually doesn't matter what you're citing, it's gotten more difficult over time.
Um, So there's been conversations around how commissions should accept or should try to incorporate innovation in their planning while managing risk. So, for example, try pilot programs, create these
Yeah.
regulatory sandboxes. Is the commission thinking about this? And are there any particular technology use cases where, limited scope experimentation has proven to be very useful to the extent that it was now scaled up across the region?
Yeah, it's and this will be, it'd be interesting to hear how other commissioners answer that. I mean, commissions historically have moved at glacial pace, and that's probably does a disservice to glaciers because we probably move slower than glaciers in a lot of cases. But there's good reason for that. And the reason for that is because it involves a whole lot of of customer money. And so we want to be right. If we're going to approve something, we want to be correct in that. And a company may say, well, I want to try this out. I want to try this product out. And if it doesn't work, their shareholders who are in on the risk are paying for that. If we get it wrong, the customers who weren't in on that decision end up paying for it. And that's typically led commissions to be move very slowly with respect to new technology. And I think that's changing some, and that's changing because the whole power generation, distribution, things like the data centers that we're talking about. As I mentioned, we've just changed our ability to redo programs and move more quickly. I think pilots have a good place. You will find people that adamantly object to pilot programs, but I think pilots come about because of what I talked about earlier and the need to see, all right, let's try this on a limited basis, see if that works. We've got a good microgrid project in Chicago, for example, and that's led to another microgrid project, using a different technology in a different part of the city. That's the kind of thing where you will see some progress there. We're doing, we've got virtual power plant plans that are coming as a part of the new legislation that will be coming from both Ameren and Commonwealth Edison, and then the commission will get to rule on that. So you're seeing that happen as well. And then a lot of other things, rooftop solar, other things started on a much more limited scale. And now the state is wholly invested in all of those things as well. I think thermal networks is another one that's now in the legislation that we'll be working on. I mentioned storage before. There's a huge commitment to storage projects now. A lot of that's been coming in over time with some of the people who are doing, for example, rooftop solar. There's at least one company that every rooftop solar project they put in, they also put in a battery as part of that. As we green lighted through legislation the ability for solar and or storage at old coal sites. The interconnection's already there, so you could do solar and or storage. We've had a couple of companies that have taken advantage of that, as well as on brownfields. So I think you're seeing more and more trying trying out of different things to try to bridge some of these gaps and see what will be the most important. I was talking to a gentleman who's a top executive at one of our ISOs yesterday, and he said something like 10-hour storage, for example. If that happens, that becomes the kind of game changer that kind of redraws the whole map of what we're expecting from resource adequacy. Well, we're doing things through procurements to incent different types of storage that may very well lead to that. And you're seeing that in Minnesota, for example, right now. And I was just looking at an article this morning about a company that says you see the 10-hour storage instead of the 4 or sometimes 8. We see 10-hour storage now. There's a company out there that's testing 100-hour. That's the kind of thing that could really, really change. And it may not come from a commission through a rate case, but it might come from legislation saying a procurement IPA. In our case, for example, you go do a procurement, see what's out there in terms of storage. Do a procurement, see what's out there in terms of new nuclear. And that's something that we could have done before, and now we're going to need to do because it's part of our responsibility under the new legislation.
Okay, thank you. So we'll take a couple questions now from the audience. We had one that came in earlier on the chat by Aaron, which was, what are some of the challenges the data centers are seeing internally in terms of infrastructure reliability?
Yeah. So one of the big issues with data centers is also, whether they're co-located to existing power sources or not, or whether they're relying on the grid. And FERC's looking at this issue now, in addition to PJM and MISO. It becomes a huge issue. So it really depends on where they're locating. So a data center who wants to locate in Illinois will talk to either their first stop is usually to talk to either ComEd or to Ameren and see, hey, we're thinking about a data center in this area, and then ComEd or Ameren, part of the upfront costs that they will get from the data center is to study that very issue and say, all right, if you're going to locate it here, here's the distribution system upgrades that are going to be needed from that, like they do with other interconnection. But they're looking at and saying, okay, I may need to build a whole new substation here to service this. So that's the kind of thing that's being talked about between the utilities and the data centers, when they come in. And then we talked about before, the large load tariffs, how that gets paid for, becomes an issue there. I hope that answered Aaron's question.
Yeah, thank you.
Great, thanks.
And I think Darren Brooks has a question.
Yeah, I just had a question. So large energy users can also, you're talking about data centers. Even energy users like Walmart can degrade the qualities of the power, and so they have to invest in harmonic filters and other things like that. Are you aware of like special when you're talking about this kind of giant scaled energy user like a data center? Do they also have special requirements for ensuring that they don't cause undue stress on the grid because they are, without having an effect on the harmonics of the system.
Yeah, that's a great question. And so yes, I mean but that's usually done at the level between the utility and the customer, in your example, the data center. So, or a Walmart, for example, if in your other example. So yeah, so that is being done so that part of the upfront studying of that, and when they come to the utility, is to decide what are you going to need, and what potential harm could you do to the system. Therefore you need to do X, Y, and Z before we can let you interconnect. All that's done, kind of in the study up front with any customer. But obviously, given the size we're talking about here, it becomes even more important. And where's their power source? What's the power source that they're going to use? Do they have their own on site? That might make a difference for that. Um, so yeah, all of those issues discussed up front. Thanks for the question.
Thank you, BJ. Any other questions?
I got one more if no one has another pressing question.
Go for it.
So, I'm based in California, San Francisco. The policy might be a little different than Illinois, but one thing I'm finding is, there's a lot of innovation coming out in the utility space that allows sort of some of our infrastructure reliability to be proactive and find issues before they become a problem. But it kind of creates this interesting bind with liability of the utility, where if essentially they know there is a problem before something happens, say for example, a conductor or a fault is going to occur and they know about it and can't respond in time, then they're majorly liable. So there's this kind of bottleneck of they don't want to know proactively, but they want to know when it happens. And I'm wondering if you've seen this in some of the work you've done with T&D, and if there could be some sort of policy change or readjustment on the horizon that's been thought about to kind of allow the utility to move into more proactive, innovative solutions without being ultimately all liable for this.
Yeah. So their liability, I mean, I'm not sure we can get them away from liability in any case, because what system they install, they've got, pretty much complete control over that, subject to review by whatever commission, whatever state they're in, the commission there. So I'm not sure the liability ever completely goes away from them. The larger issue that we see, and I think you see in other states as well, is if they put that system in and they do all that they need to do to be proactive, to your example, are they going to get reimbursed for that? Are the ratepayers going to reimburse from that? Or what's the situation that's set up so that they get reimbursement? Is it from the data center itself? Is it from that company? Are they spreading that cost out among the other ratepayers? And different states react to that differently. We've got now we're in a multi-year grid plan and rate plan. When they bring new business on, they being the utilities, when they bring new business on, there's kind of an exception from the amount of money that they were authorized to get to be able to do that. So then what they have to come in and show us that they needed to do that and it was necessary to do it because of this particular customer. When we get changes in large load tariffs or legislation that sets a framework like some states do, some states will talk about those issues and say, yeah, you can do that, but the data center has to pay for that, or that has to be an upfront cost that's assumed. Liability, I think, is still going to be there because it's still their system and they still operate it. I'm not sure how you get totally away from that, but there are ways to try to make sure that wherever you are, the right system is being installed to try to match whatever the need is going to be from the customer.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thanks, Aaron. Any other questions? There isn't. I have one more. Sure, Scott. There Now we know that the AI boom is going to change energy for sure. But to what extent is energy regulation going to be changed by AI? Apart from a lot of what we do in energy, in power engineering and energy regulation requires, optimization,
Yeah.
requires an analytical review of documents, requires extensive review of, accounting documents to understand CapEx and OpEx. And this stuff we're seeing can easily be either automated or managed properly by, not managed properly, but at least managed faster or analyzed faster by um, AI. Is this something that the commission is thinking about? Because I know that some states like, Minnesota have a policy for the use of, AI tools within, government agencies. Is something Illinois is thinking about? And what are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, we haven't seen as much from the agency side and how we operate. We are seeing it in, I know the utilities are using it and ways to try to figure out how to optimize different pieces of their distribution network, or the RTOs are using it. One of the issues has been how slow their interconnection queues have been, and in studying, um, you know, all that they need to study before something can interconnect to their system. I know they're using AI to help speed up some of the studies that are going on now. We haven't seen it as much. Speaking for myself, I read all the materials the old-fashioned way, and so we're trying to be as careful as we can to make sure that we're watching out for consumers as best we can here, and so we haven't used it as much internally now. That may change. I don't know for sure going forward.
Do you see a value in it, especially, for example, if you get a filing by Amarin that is, 5,000 pages and you have 30 days to go through it? Do you think that the use of these models, especially as they get better, could help, commission staff?
Yeah, yeah, but I don't think we're there. I don't think we're there quite yet. And I mean, there are through just the normal technology that we've got through our computers. There's a lot of things that you can do to go find. Every time the utility mentions X in their filing, you can find that. And I mean, there's lots of things that you can already do. I know AI could possibly improve on that. We're just not there quite yet.
Thank you. And the final question, looking ahead 5 to 10 years, what regulatory or system shift do you see happening in the sector?
Yeah, I think there's this is with us now, but I think it's going to continue the whole look at affordability. It's always been a thing for a commissioner. That's one of your main charges is to make sure that the system functions, but it functions at the lowest feasible cost for the customers. You're seeing that nationally now. I don't think that's going away. When we passed the infrastructure bill that I mentioned early on in our talk, we were able to do that without customers noticing a change in their bills because the commodity price was so low at the time. So you could do all the distribution infrastructure changes, and I, looking at my bill, wouldn't have really noticed that at all. There's no headroom right now anywhere. Everything is maxed out cost-wise. Everything's taking more time than it used to with supply chains and other issues. And affordability becomes something that's really key to that, and it's everybody's issue. So we're looking at things, and I don't think we're alone in this. I think other commissions will as well. We're not saying, all right, was that a good thing? If you're coming into us to try to get authorization or reimbursement on something, not only was that a good thing to do, or is that a good thing to do you need to do it right now? Is that something that you need to do right now, or can that be looked at a little bit later? Those kinds of questions are going to get asked even more frequently going forward. I think the looking at more control for customers, I think, is a trend you're going to see. The kind of passive customer who the old factoid was, they look at their, or pay attention to their utility bills other than when they're paying the bill, 7 minutes a year or whatever that was. That used to be the factoid that we used to work off of. That's changing. Customers are used now to having more control over what they buy and when they buy and how they buy. And I think that's going to be a trend as well, that you're going to see a much more distributed system than we've seen traditionally. You're already seeing that, but I think that's going to be a trend going forward. And, hopefully some changes at the federal level too, from what we've seen in the last year, not making this a partisan thing, but, we've seen all of the money get pulled back. At a time where we're saying there's an energy crisis, the administration saying there's an energy crisis, but let's pull back a whole bunch of money from innovation and from the very things, renewable energy, that most companies are trying to put onto the grid right now. And at the same time, we're going to spend a whole lot of money, we already are, to keep open coal plants that companies said, weren't necessary. I think that's going to change over time. I think that's a trend we're going to see. And then what's the next innovation? We talked a lot about that, but is it a different kind of nuclear that's coming? Are we going to find 100-hour storage commonplace or 10-hour storage commonplace? If we do a lot of the things we talked about in terms of resource adequacy and in terms of cost and affordability, that changes dramatically. Is there more we can do with thermal networks, for example, the system? But we're going to see that the innovation's going to happen, and I don't know exactly what that is. And then the other question is, what's how real is the load growth? How long does this last? Is this a few year thing, or are we gonna, 10 years from now when you have me back on your show, are we gonna be talking about, boy, we got a new batch of 100 gigawatts full of data centers that are gonna be coming. How real and how long is that load growth gonna last?
Thank you so much for that, sir. We are at time. I appreciate you joining us here today. Thank you for the great conversation, and thanks to our audience. Asked great questions. And thanks for being here. Hope it was useful to everybody. And with that, I would say have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thanks. Take care, everybody.
Thanks, Doug. Thanks, Tam.
Thanks.